In the quiet suburbs of Middle America where lawns are trimmed and neighbors wave from porches and children ride bicycles down tree-lined streets, there existed a boy who seemed unremarkable. A boy who would grow into a man whose name would become synonymous with darkness so profound that even decades later the world still struggles to comprehend how such monstrosity could hide behind such ordinary eyes. And this is a story not just of horror, but of the terrifying fragility of the human mind, of how isolation can ferment into obsession and obsession into unspeakable acts. A story that asks us to confront the uncomfortable truth that monsters are not born fully formed, but are sometimes made in the crucible of loneliness and compulsion and the desperate human need for connection twisted into something unrecognizable. And here on Crime and Prejudice, we don't just recount the facts of true crime. We dive deeper into the psychology, the warning signs, the societal failures, the humanity that exists even in the darkest corners, because understanding is not excusing and awareness is our best defense against tragedy. So if you're looking for stories told with empathy, nuance, and a commitment to honoring victims while exploring the complex psychology of those who harm, please subscribe and join us on this journey into the shadow side of human nature. Jeffrey Dahmer was born in 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to a mother who struggled with mental illness and a father who worked long hours as a chemist, leaving young Jeffrey alone for extended periods in a household marked by tension and his mother's pill dependency and frequent hospitalizations. And by all accounts, he was a curious child who collected insects and small animal bones he found in the woods, fascinated by the inner workings of living things in a way that seemed innocent enough at first. Just a boy interested in biology, but there was something else stirring beneath that curiosity, a need to possess, to control, to keep things from leaving him. As adolescence arrived, Jeffrey withdrew further into himself, his parents' marriage deteriorating into bitter arguments and eventual divorce. And he discovered alcohol as a teenager, drinking heavily to numb feelings he couldn't name or express. Feelings of profound disconnection from other people, of desire he didn't understand, of fantasies that frightened him even as they consumed his thoughts. And his classmates remember him as the weird kid who would show up drunk to school, who acted out for attention in bizarre ways, who seemed desperate to be noticed even as he pushed everyone away. By the time he graduated high school in 1978, his mother had left, taking his younger brother with her, and his father had moved out to be with a new partner, leaving 18-year-old Jeffrey completely alone in the family home. And it was during this period of total isolation and abandonment that something inside him finally broke, that the fantasies he had harbored for years, fantasies of having complete control over another person, of having someone who could never leave, finally manifested into terrible reality. His first victim was a young hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks, whom Jeffrey picked up and brought back to his empty house under the pretense of drinking beer and hanging out. And when Stephen wanted to leave, Jeffrey struck him with a barbell, because the thought of being alone again was unbearable. Because in his fractured mind, keeping someone forever, even through death, was preferable to abandonment. And afterward, he dismembered the body and scattered the remains in the woods behind his house. And then he tried to continue with life as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just crossed a line from which there was no return. For 9 years after that first murder, Jeffrey managed to restrain the urges that plagued him. He joined the army but was discharged due to his alcoholism. He moved in with his grandmother in Wisconsin. He worked various jobs and tried to maintain a facade of normalcy. But the compulsion was always there, lurking beneath the surface, fed by loneliness and alcohol and a psychosexual obsession that he couldn't satisfy through normal means. And in 1987, the killing resumed, and this time it wouldn't stop. Over the next 4 years, Jeffrey would lure young men, primarily from marginalized communities, primarily gay men and men of color who society often overlooked, back to his apartment with promises of money for photographs or simply companionship. And once there, he would drug them and strangle them, and then engage in acts of necrophilia, because what he truly craved was not the act of killing itself, but possession, absolute control over another human being who couldn't reject him or leave him. And he would keep bodies or body parts in his apartment, storing skulls and preserving remains, because he wanted these people with him always, wanted to literally consume them, to make them part of himself. a grotesque perversion of intimacy born from profound psychological damage and complete inability to form normal human connections. The progression of his crimes showed an escalating desperation and experimentation with control. He would photograph his victims at various stages. He attempted crude lobotomies on some while they were still alive by drilling holes in their skulls and pouring acid into their brains, hoping to create compliant living zombies who would stay with him willingly. Experiments that failed and resulted only in more death. And his apartment became a charnel house filled with evidence of his crimes. Severed heads in the refrigerator, a barrel of acid containing decomposing torsos, photographs documenting every stage of his process. And somehow, incredibly, neighbors complained about smells and strange noises, but nothing was done. And once police actually encountered one of his victims, a 14-year-old Laotian boy named Konarak Sinthasumphone, who had escaped the apartment naked and drugged and bleeding. And when Jeffrey convinced the officers that this was just a domestic dispute between adult lovers, they returned the boy to Jeffrey's apartment, where he was murdered that same night. A failure of the justice system so profound it still haunts the Milwaukee Police Department decades later. By 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer had killed 17 people, 17 individuals with families and dreams and futures. 17 lives extinguished to feed one man's bottomless need for connection warped through the lens of severe mental illness and paraphilia. And it all finally ended when Tracy Edwards managed to escape with handcuffs still dangling from one wrist and flagged down police who followed him back to apartment 213 and discovered the horror show within. Discovered Polaroids of dismembered bodies, discovered human remains, discovered the physical evidence of atrocities that would shock even hardened homicide detectives. During his arrest and subsequent interrogation, Jeffrey was cooperative, almost relieved that it was over, confessing in detail to his crimes and expressing what seemed like genuine remorse, saying he knew what he did was wrong, that he felt like he couldn't stop himself, that the compulsion was too strong and the alcohol made it easier to act on impulses he knew were monstrous. And psychiatrists who evaluated him found him legally sane, able to distinguish right from wrong even if he felt powerless to control his actions. And this raised uncomfortable questions about culpability and mental illness and where we draw the line between evil and sickness. His trial in 1992 was televised and the world watched as victim impact statements were read and families confronted the man who had destroyed their lives. And Jeffrey showed little emotion throughout, speaking only briefly to say he took full responsibility and wished he could undo what he had done. And the jury found him sane and guilty, and he was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, nearly 1,000 years in prison, and he was sent to Columbia Correctional Institution where he would spend his remaining days. In prison, Jeffrey reportedly became a born-again Christian, reading religious texts and speaking with ministers. Whether this represented genuine repentance or simply another attempt to understand himself and find meaning in his actions is impossible to know. But what is clear is that he struggled to comprehend his own psychology, to reconcile the part of him that knew his actions were horrific with the part that had felt compelled to commit them. And in interviews he gave from prison, he spoke about his crimes with disturbing clinical detachment, describing his methods and motivations as if analyzing someone else's behavior. And he warned that pornography and alcohol had been contributing factors in his descent, though psychologists noted these were more symptoms than causes of much deeper psychological disturbances likely rooted in his childhood, experiences of abandonment, and his emerging awareness of his sexuality in an era and environment where being gay was deeply stigmatized. On November 28, 1994, less than 3 years into his sentence, Jeffrey Dahmer was murdered by a fellow inmate named Christopher Scarver, who beat him to death with a metal bar from the prison weight room. And some saw this as a form of justice, as prisoners often target those who have harmed children or committed particularly heinous crimes. But others recognized it as simply another act of violence in a cycle that seemed to have no end. And Jeffrey died at age 34, the same age many of his victims would never reach. And the world was left to grapple with his legacy, with what his crimes revealed about society's blind spots, about how we fail vulnerable populations, about how we miss warning signs, about the nature of evil itself. This story is based on real events and is shared for educational and informational purposes, It is not intended for viewers under 18 and does not glorify violence in any form. Please watch responsibly. The case of Jeffrey Dahmer forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, about how isolation and mental illness and childhood trauma can create catastrophic outcomes when left unaddressed, about how society's marginalization of certain groups made them vulnerable to predators, about how our systems of intervention and protection failed repeatedly. And while understanding the psychology behind such crimes doesn't excuse them, it does illuminate the importance of mental health, support, and early intervention in treating all people with dignity and recognizing warning signs before tragedy occurs. Because monsters aren't born in a vacuum. They're created through a complex interplay of biology and environment and choice. And the most terrifying thing about Jeffrey Dahmer isn't that he was uniquely evil, but that he was human. That somewhere in his damaged psyche was a person who craved connection and love, but whose ability to experience those things in healthy ways was so profoundly broken that he could only approximate them through control and possession and death. And that should horrify us not because it makes him sympathetic, but because it reminds us that the line between humanity and monstrosity is thinner than we like to believe, maintained only through empathy and connection and the social bonds that keep us tethered to our better selves. And when those bonds fray, when someone falls through every crack in every safety net, when loneliness curdles into obsession and fantasy into action, we are all diminished by the result, victim and perpetrator and society alike. And so we remember the 17 people whose lives were taken. We remember Stephen Hicks and Stephen Twomey and James Dockstader and Richard Guerrero and Anthony Sears and Raymond Smith and Edward Smith and Ernest Miller and David Thomas and Curtis Straughter and Errol Lindsay and Tony Hughes and Conorak Synthesumphone and Matt Turner and Jeremiah Weinberger and Oliver Lacey and Joseph Braidhoft. We remember them not as statistics or as entries in the catalog of one man's crimes, but as individuals who deserved to live, who deserved safety, who deserved to be seen and valued by a society that too often looked away. And in remembering them, we commit ourselves to doing better, to creating systems that protect rather than fail the vulnerable, to recognizing that true crime isn't entertainment, but tragedy, isn't about fascination with killers, but about understanding how violence occurs so we might prevent it. And that is the mission here at Crime and Prejudice, to tell these stories with respect and nuance and an unflinching commitment to truth. Because only by looking directly at the darkness can we hope to keep it at bay. Only by understanding how someone becomes a Jeffrey Dahmer can we identify and intervene before the next potential tragedy unfolds. And that is the chilling lesson his story teaches us, that evil often wears an ordinary face, that monsters walk among us unrecognized until it's too late, that the person sitting next to you on the bus or living in the apartment down the hall might be hiding thoughts and urges and fantasies that would make your blood run cold. And we'll never truly know what's happening in another person's mind. We can only try to build a world where pain doesn't fester into pathology, where loneliness doesn't metastasize into violence, where help is available before the point of no return. And yet, despite our best efforts, some people will still fall through the cracks. Some will still choose to act on their darkest impulses. And when they do, all we can do is bear witness, seek justice, remember the victims, and try to understand, not to excuse, but to prevent. And in that understanding, perhaps we find a sliver of meaning in senseless tragedy, a reason to believe that these stories matter beyond their shock value, that by examining the worst of what humans are capable of, we somehow honor the best of what we could be. And that is the terrible paradox at the heart of true crime, that we study death to affirm life, that we explore darkness to appreciate light, that we confront evil to strengthen our commitment to good. And Jeffrey Dahmer's story endures not because we're fascinated by his monstrosity, but because we're terrified by his humanity, by the recognition that under different circumstances, with different brain chemistry, different childhood experiences, different choices at crucial moments, any of us might harbor darkness we can't control. And that thought should keep us humble and compassionate and vigilant, should remind us to check on the lonely person, to take mental health seriously, to build communities where everyone is seen and valued and connected. Because isolation is the breeding ground for so much suffering and connection, real human connection, might just be the antidote to the kind of pathological loneliness that consumed Jeffrey Dahmer and through him consumed 17 innocent lives. And so we end where we began, in the quiet suburbs where evil wore an ordinary face, where a man who craved intimacy pursued it through death, where the unthinkable became reality because no one intervened until it was far too late. And we're left with questions that have no satisfying answers, with horror that time doesn't diminish, with the knowledge that such things have happened before and will happen again unless we as a society commit ourselves to seeing each other, truly seeing each other, in all our vulnerability and potential for both good and harm. And that is the legacy of Jeffrey Dahmer, not the gruesome details of his crimes, but the warning his story provides about what happens when we fail to recognize the suffering in our midst, when we ignore the marginalized, when we let someone fall so far into darkness that they can't find their way back. And if his victims' deaths are to mean anything at all, it must be in the lessons we learn, the systems we improve, the people we save before they become either victims or perpetrators in the next iteration of this timeless tragic cycle. Because in the end, we're all just humans trying to survive in a world that can be cruel and isolating and incomprehensible. And the only thing standing between civilization and chaos is our willingness to care for one another, to intervene when we see someone struggling, to build a world where Jeffrey Dahmers are identified and helped before they can do harm. And that is both our greatest challenge and our most important responsibility as members of a shared humanity.